All right. Excuse me. So I'll try this again. So today I'm going to review for my horror series of books set in winter. I think I've decided to call it Snowy Screams. So I'm going to review The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. And it's a perfect book for this time of year because it's set in that transition between fall and winter. So it's set just after American Thanksgiving, which makes it a great one for this time of year. First of all, I'm going to say it's the best book I've read this year. 5 stars, highly recommended. And just a little bit about Stephen Graham Jones. He's a Blackfeet Native American author. He's based out of Colorado, and I think he teaches at a university there. I think it's the University of Boulder. And he's very quickly becoming one of my favorite authors. Last year I read Mongrels, which on its surface is a story about werewolves, but it's also a story about a story about a family, and I really appreciate that. So, fair warning, there's spoilers ahead, and if I'm looking over here, it's because I've got notes on the computer, so don't mind me. So, The Only Good Indians is about a group of childhood friends named Ricky, Lewis, Gabriel, and Cassidy. And 10 years ago, they went on a hunting trip. And they were hunting elk on the, I believe it was elder land, which is why they weren't supposed to be there. They were trespassing, so they weren't able to take the meat home. And the trip kind of went wrong. And Lewis ended up killing a female elk, which I think is called a cow. They call them cow and bull. And she had a calf. And so she died really, really hard trying to protect her calf. And so that was the first sort of hint that this isn't maybe a normal elk. And so it's also never really stated, but now it's as to why it takes her 10 years to get her revenge. But 10 years later, the guys all start seeing the spirit, this elk head woman. And it's kind of in some ways it's a little bit of a riff on the Skinwalker story, which, by the way, are some of my favorites. I absolutely love those stories about Skinwalker encounters, which, I mean, obviously is probably not, in terms of what they represent, is probably not, something that you should be entertaining, but I quite enjoy listening to the YouTube videos about, where people talk about their Skinwalker encounters. But this creature is also, she's a creature born of violence and tragedy, and she's, you just feel so much pity for her. She's not malevolent, she's just sad and angry. And each of the characters sort of has a run-in with her. And Stephen Graham Jones' biggest, I think, what's best about his writing is that he just creates these wonderful characters. And even if you're not native, they're characters that everybody knows that guy who's drinking means he can't see his kid. And everybody knows that guy who gets in fights outside of redneck bars for no apparent reason. And it's a capsule of the lives of these characters. But don't get too attached to them, because it's a tragedy. They're doomed. And that's what makes it really heartbreaking too, is there's a really interesting subtext that this isn't just the story about guys being stalked by a vengeful spirit. It's also a look at the lives of Native American men and the way that they're marred. Their lives are marred by addiction and violence and suicide in a couple cases and tragedy. And that this is, it's something that lives with them, but you wish it didn't have to. And poverty. And it's not heavy-handed, but the way that each character dies is I feel compelled to say this, and again, there's spoilers here, but you get the sense that it's the most Indian way to die. So the first character, and another thing that I was thinking about is when Stephen King wrote The Outsider, he talked about how he's fascinated by an entity getting inside of someone, creating a bunch of destruction, and then the person's sitting there in the aftermath going, oh crap, because they're the ones that have to deal with it. So in some ways, this is how the first couple of characters see the elk woman, that she's doing all this destructive stuff, and they can see her, but they're helpless to stop her. And they're the ones that end up suffering for it. So the first character is in a redneck bar, and he goes out to take a leak, and he sees these elk, and they're stomping on the redneck's trucks. Stomp, stomp. And of course, what does a redneck love more than his truck? Probably not much. But the elk disappear because, maybe they're in the character's mind, or maybe, it's a haunting, but then he's left going, oh crap. And he ends up getting beaten to death outside a redneck bar, which unfortunately is the reality of what has happened to many, many Native men. And then another character is gunned down by Stades, and then there's another scene where a couple of characters have a sweat lodge, but it's a tent that's made of old clothes. And so there's this way of bringing things that we sort of understand from Native culture, but looking at them in the modern context. And I really appreciate that. I really appreciate the way that the Native culture is written by somebody who is part of the culture, but understands how removed the modern context is from it. If that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. But anyway, it's a very tragic story, and it can be kind of hard to read, but it's definitely worth it, and especially if you like character studies, lots of action. It's very suspenseful. So, The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. I hope you're reading lots of horror, and have a great day.